I'd like to introduce to you Bill Johnston, and Bill's going to be looking at the Bureau of Meteorology data and be able to show us some of the quality of it and the inconsistencies of it. So thanks very much, Bill. Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Senator Roberts, for inviting me, and ladies and gentlemen. I prepared a bit of a talk here, but I'll just have to whiz through some of the start of it. The main points that I want to brush across has to do with the quality of Australian temperature monitoring sites. I claim they're inconsistent over time. Site control is very poor, and the history of many sites is not known. Data are useful for describing the weather. They have been describing the weather for a long time, but they're not much use for actually detecting trends. I'll get on to that. Homogenisation of data, changing the data, creates spurious trends, extremes, and trends in extremes. So if I just move on, most of Australia's monitoring sites are affected by site and instrument changes that impact on measurements. And we know the local things like trees grow and pavements are laid and the road gets sealed and developments happen and the site has to move because the airport wants to build a new terminal. Those things all affect data. I'm sorry about this, the thing's not working as well as it should. For example, in in Western Australia, you notice that in 1919 the screen was moved within a foot of a building. In 1924 it moved into the open. In 1951 it blew down because someone ran a car into it previously and never fixed it. In 1961 it moved to the golf club, then it moved to the army, and then it's moved back to the golf club and moved to the agriculture department, and now it's at a bowling club surrounded by fake grass. And they actually measure temperature there, and they've had record temperatures there recently. At Snowtown in South Australia, they moved the screen due to a building. The site's judged as only fair. The screen's raised by a foot, then they lower it by a foot, then a small screen's provided, new screen and small move. The site's now in a paddock out of town surrounded by cultivation. So there's the Snowtown site in town, and there's the site out there, and if you actually zoom in, if you zoom out from that site out of town, the site's surrounded by hundreds of thousands of acres or hectares of cultivation. No transpiration in summer, so of course it's hot. And of course they have record temperatures too. At Northam in WA, you can pick the difference. In 2010, the site is there surrounded by fake grass. They're fake bowling greens. That's a three-storey regional hospital. And then they built this there a couple of years ago, and the temperature went up. And of course they had record temperatures as well. In the olden days, temperatures were measured various ways. At Cape Border, that little machine up there, I don't have a pointer and I can't use the mouse, but the gadget up there is a screen that holds the thermometers. It's turned manually away from the sun each day or seasonally, and the temperatures are read each day. That's called the glacier stand. At Sydney Observatory, temperatures were measured in that octagonal house in 1864. They like growing roses around the lattice, and of course breeze blowing through roses cools the air. The temperatures are artificially low. Comparable measurements of temperature requires thermometers are uniformly exposed, and Stephenson screens didn't really come along until about 1907, and protocols relating to sites were not tightened up until about 1925. However, not all Stephenson screens are the same. At Sydney Observatory in 1903, either the bloke's fairly short or the screen's fairly high. Len Walker at Good Island in 1940, either the screen's too low or he's a big guy. But you can see that there's a difference, and it does make a difference whether the temperature's measured here or here and what the screen is like. At Mildura in 1956, that's the screen. It doesn't look very standard to me. It's not a louvered screen, and yet Mildura is a high quality site. Hawkesbury Ag College in 1913, they had a screen with an iron roof, And there were many of those screens around the place, and of course the iron roof heats up and the screen's too warm. Air radio is the basis of a lot of our weather observations. Air radio was set up in 1939, basically along Australia's expanding air corridors. Alice Springs Air Radio had a Stevenson screen near those three sheds, which they used for launching balloons for tracking wind speed and direction. Darwin Air Radio in 1939. The screen's out there in the paddock. You can actually see it in the paddock. That became the RAF base and is now the International Airport at Darwin. So the airport changed around, very much changed around where the temperatures were measured. And at Carnarvon, they had a fairly crude air radio setup. Launceston Air Radio was set up in 1939, and they have a Met lawn on the left-hand side, and you can just see a screen there on the edge of it, and it looks pretty good. And at Cambridge, which was Hobart's original airport, the screens are actually just outside the back door, so they didn't have to walk very far to measure the temperature. Onslow Air Radio in 1939 on the West Australian coast. In 1964, it's exactly the same building down here. And along came Cyclone Trixie in 1975 and blew the whole place to pieces. Halls Creek is often in the news as being a place that has very high temperatures. Air radio was set up there, and the guys actually had an official push bike to ride into town. It's 11 kilometres into town, and they were issued an official push bike. What actually happens at Halls Creek is that the town expanded out to the airport, and so we see in 2006 there's a Met Office there on the far left. In 2006 we see a Met Office, the same Met Office over there in 2011, and now we see the Met Office, and the observations are actually taken just there, being closed in by the town, and of course they have record temperatures in Halls Creek these days. I'll skip that one. That's just talking about the actual innards of how temperatures are measured inside a Stevenson screen. It's important also that sites are maintained, and there's a 15-year, it's probably been a 15-year period since the old screen at Scone was serviced, and that's what they end up looking like, and some were not serviced for 30 or 40 years, some of the early screens. Screens that get dirty inside, that's a large screen. It's fairly dirty inside, and that's an ag research farm. The screen on the left-hand side is a small screen at an airport in Victoria, and they're all not maintained very well. At Bridgetown in Western Australia, they forgot to get Jim's mowing to come on time, and you can't actually see the rain gauge. And same at Viewbank in Melbourne, you can't see the rain gauge there because they haven't maintained the site. The point I'm saying is that the quality of individual sites seems pretty haphazard. Down at Launceston, you'll have to pardon their French, but down at Launceston at the Tea Tree Brand sewage treatment works, they have an automatic weather station there, and those little brown piles are precisely what as described. And in Tenterfield they have a screen near they have lots of land around Tenterfield to have a screen. Cape Bruni, I hope to slip through all this. In 1947 and 1950 they built telephone exchanges in post office yards, and that warmed all these sites. Bridgetown Exchange is there, two buildings were built in the Orange post office yard. At Adelaide Airport they moved the Met Station in 2002 or 2001 and 2 over to the left-hand side of the airport there. In 2010, in 2011, there's a supermarket beside it, and if you get up close to the data, you find that there's a wind profiler array very close to where temperature's measured. There's a canine security building that's air-conditioned. There's an air-conditioned building beyond it, a hectare of aircraft apron, and the end of the supermarket. So record temperatures at Adelaide as well, and the same in town in Adelaide. So are records really records? I doubt it. I very much doubt it. Here at Badgerys Creek in Sydney, often in the news for having high temperatures. They set the site up around 2000 in a paddock with grass that was a grazed paddock. By 2016, the whole place is cultivated. There's no evaporation in summer and they get record temperatures. But I think, really, I can't do justice to this. I think I'll have to get to the end of it and just draw some conclusions. I was going to tell a little story about Sydney Observatory and things that happened at Darwin, but we won't go there. What I've tried to do is to highlight some of the most common problems associated with climate monitoring, the sorts of things that interfere with measurements and cause measurements not to be reliable. Changes at sites such as relocations and introduction of small screens and post office yards being crowded out by new buildings, they affect temperature trends and trends in extremes. And I was going to spend a little bit of time talking about homogenisation, which I think is homogenisation is when they change the data to try and account for site changes, and across all the stations I've looked at, it's a very arbitrary process. So that's it.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
What a rush.
Yeah, so thank you very, very much. Now, while we're setting up for Howard, who's coming up to give a presentation, have we got some questions that we can ask Peter from our viewers on Facebook?
Here's one. This is directed at me. How can you claim that climate change data is fake and at the same time, this is from Gavin Matheson, and at the same time use the data to support your argument that the climate isn't changing? You can only pick a cherry once. Well, it's very simple, Gavin. The climate change claims that spreading alarm use a very selective use of data, and some of that data has been corrupted. That's the data we say is fake. Most of this data is not used, even though it's available, is not used by those pushing the claims that we're affecting climate. And so we're showing all the data, not just a little piece of it. And you can see for your own self what the data shows.